He buried his fortune under a stranger's name and walked into the dust with nothing but a busted hat and a lie. Everyone who ever smiled at Silas Granger smiled at his money, never at him. So he burned that life down on purpose. What he found at the end of a dirt road would either prove every cynical thing he believed about people or break him wide open in a way 40 years of cattle deals never could. If you want to see how far this story travels, hit like, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay until the end. The wind out on the Granger Range smelled like money. Silas Granger used to think that was a compliment to himself, the way a man thinks well of his own cooking. Dust and sage and hot leather, and underneath it all the particular stink of a fortune nobody else could touch. 62 years old, and he'd built an empire out of a 40-acre claim his father left him with more debt than dirt. 12,000 head of cattle now, a house with 11 rooms and only one man living in it. A name that made bankers in 3 territories straighten their collars when they said it. And not one person, not a single soul in 30 years, who'd looked at him and seen anything but the number attached to his name. He figured that out on a Tuesday. Of all the ordinary days to figure out a thing like that, it happened at his own dinner table. He'd hosted a gathering for the territorial governor. 14 guests? China, his late wife picked out before she died of fever in 61, a roast that took the cook 2 days. Silas sat at the head of that table and watched a young rancher's wife laugh too hard at a joke that wasn't funny, watched a banker lean in like Silas's words were scripture, watched the governor's aide refill his glass before he'd even noticed it was low. Everybody at that table wanted something. He could see it in the angle of their shoulders, the way conversations curved back toward him, no matter where they started. He excused himself before dessert and stood out on the porch in the cold, looking at his own land stretching out flat and dark to the horizon, and he thought, I could die tomorrow, and not one of these people in my house would grieve me. They'd grieve the will reading. That thought sat in him like a swallowed stone for 2 weeks. He couldn't shake it loose. He tried working it out of himself, rode fence lines he hadn't ridden in a decade, sat with his foreman going over books he already knew by heart. But the stone stayed put. So he made a decision that his lawyer, his foreman, and the one cousin who still wrote him letters all thought was the decision of a man losing his mind. He was going to disappear, not for good, not forever, but long enough to find out if there was a single person left on God's earth. He didn't say that exact phrase, not out loud, not where anyone would hear something that sounded too much like a prayer, long enough to find out if there was a single person who'd treat him decent without knowing what was in his pockets. You're 62 years old, his foreman, a leathery man named Tom Reeve, told him in the barn the night before he left. You want to go play poor man for a season. That's your business, Silas, but you tell me where you're headed at least. I'm not chasing rumors of your corpse across 3 counties. I'll send word, Silas said. He was already dressed for it, a coat gone thin at the elbows, boots he'd bought secondhand off a drifter passing through for $2, and a story about a poker game, a hat with a hole worn clean through the brim. He looked, he thought, examining himself in the cracked mirror by the tack room, like exactly nobody, like a man the world had already finished with. It felt better than he expected it to. And if something happens to you out there, some fool doesn't know who you are and puts a bullet in you over a horse? Then I die the way most men die, Silas said, without anybody owing me anything for it. Tom didn't like that answer. Tom didn't like much about the whole plan, but 30 years working under Silas Granger had taught him there wasn't a lot of point arguing once the man's jaw set a certain way. He handed Silas a small folded paper instead, a letter, sealed, with instructions to open it only if 6 months passed without word. What's in it? Everything you'd need to know if you decided to stay gone, Tom said, not meeting his eyes. I had Hargrove draw it up, just in case. Silas took it, and for a second something in his chest went tight and strange, because in 30 years that was about as close as Tom Reeve had ever come to telling him he loved him. He left before sunrise the next morning on an old gelding nobody would look at twice, with $40 sewn into the lining of his coat, enough, he figured, to feel poor without actually risking his neck, and he didn't look back at the house with the 11 rooms. The frontier, it turned out, did not care who you used to be. That was the first thing Silas learned, somewhere around day 4, and it landed on him harder than he expected. He'd ridden through towns where men once removed their hats when his name came up in conversation, And now he sat at the edge of those same towns, and nobody so much as glanced his direction. A saloon owner in a place called Coldwater told him to keep moving if he wasn't buying. A rancher he asked about work looked him up and down. The thin coat, the holed hat, the gelding with its ribs showing through, and said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, "Got nothing for a man who looks like you, friend. Sorry." It stung. He told himself it shouldn't, that this was exactly the experiment he'd set out to run, but it stung all the same, in a place he didn't know was still tender after 62 years. He slept under the stars more nights than he wanted to count. His back ached in ways it never had in his feather bed. He learned what it felt like to be hungry. Actually hungry, not the polite appetite of a man who knows supper's an hour away, but the hollow gnawing kind that made him irritable and slow-thinking by the second day without a real meal. He learned that a stranger's kindness, when it came at all, usually came with a price tag attached, even if the man offering it didn't think of it that way. A meal for an hour of work splitting wood. A night in a barn for mucking out the stalls first. Fair trades, all of them. Honest. But not what he was looking for. He was beginning to think the stone in his chest had been right all along. That there was nothing left in people but transaction. That even the poor traded kindness like currency because it was the only currency they had. When he came across the Harper place, it wasn't much to look at. A homestead maybe 2 miles off the main road, set back behind a stand of cottonwoods gone half dead from the drought that had been squeezing the whole valley dry for 2 seasons running. The house was small, 1 story, with a roof that had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. A barn that leaned a little to the west, like it was tired of standing. A garden plot that should have been green and was instead mostly brown, with a few stubborn rows of something, beans maybe, or squash, holding on out of pure spite against the sky. Silas almost rode past it. He'd ridden past dozens of places like it, but the gelding was favoring its left front leg by then, and the light was going gray toward evening, and his stomach had stopped growling sometime that afternoon and gone quiet in the way that worried him more than the growling had. He rode up slow, the way a man does when he doesn't want to spook a household that's alone out here with no men visible and every reason to be careful of strangers. A woman came out onto the porch before he'd gotten within 50 yards. She had a shotgun in her hands, not pointed at him exactly, but not pointed away either, held with the easy competence of someone who'd used it before and would again if she needed to. "That's far enough," she called out. Silas stopped the gelding. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him from the porch. He was aware, in a way he hadn't quite been before this moment, of exactly how he must look, gaunt from 4 days of half meals, dust ground into every seam of his clothes, a beard he hadn't bothered to keep neat going gray and wild at the jaw. He looked, he realized, like every drifter she'd probably been warned about her whole life. "You looking for trouble?" she said. "You found the wrong house. I got nothing worth stealing, and I know how to use this." "I believe you," Silas said. "I'm not looking for trouble, ma'am. My horse is going lame, and I haven't eaten today. I'd be obliged for water if you can spare it. I'll move on after." There was a long quiet. The wind picked up a little, rattling the dead leaves still clinging to the cottonwoods. Somewhere behind the house, Silas heard a chicken complaining about something, and somewhere closer, inside the house, the small creak of a door. A child, probably, peering out to see what their mother was looking at. The woman lowered the shotgun finally, though she didn't put it down entirely. "Get down off that horse slow," she said, "and keep your hands where I can see them till I say otherwise." He did as she told him. Up close, on his own 2 feet, he could see her better. A woman somewhere in her 30s, sun-weathered in the way the land out here weathered everyone eventually, with dark hair pulled back tight and a dress that had been mended at the hem more than once. Her eyes were sharp, taking in everything about him. The bad horse, the bad boots, the way his hands shook slightly from hunger when he held them up, and something in her face shifted, just slightly, from wariness towards something else. Not trust, not yet, but less than wariness. "What's your name?" she asked. He almost said it, the real one. It sat right there on his tongue, 62 years of habit, and he caught it just in time and swallowed it back down. "Silas," he said. Just that. No Granger. "Silas what?" "Just Silas, if it's all the same to you, ma'am." He met her eyes when he said it, not defiant, just honest in the only way he could afford to be honest right now. A man traveling like I am, sometimes it's better all around if a name doesn't carry more than it needs to. He expected that to end it. Expected her to raise the shotgun back up, tell him to keep moving, that she didn't host men who wouldn't even give a full name. Instead, something almost like understanding passed over her face. "I'm Evelyn Harper," she said. "This is my place. Was my husband's before." She didn't say before what. She didn't have to. Silas had been around enough widows in his life, had watched his own foreman bury 2 wives to fever and 1 to a horse accident, to know the shape of that particular silence. "Sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said. "Everybody's sorry," Evelyn said, and there was something tired in it, not bitter exactly, just worn thin from being said to so many times it had lost its meaning. "Won't bring rain, though, and won't bring him back either. Come on, there's a trough round back for your horse, and I expect I can find you something for your stomach, even if it isn't much." What she found him was, by any measure Silas had ever applied to a meal, almost nothing. A heel of cornbread, hard around the edges from sitting a day too long. A cup of water from the well, cool and a little mineral tasting. That was it. That was the whole offering, and she gave it to him like it was nothing at all to give, setting it down on the porch step beside him without ceremony, without the careful counting out he half expected from a household this poor. He looked at it for a second longer than was polite. "This isn't charity I'm asking for free," he said. "I can work for it. Mend that barn door maybe, looks like it's hanging by one hinge. Eat first," Evelyn said. "Talk about working after. A starving man doesn't do good work anyway," my husband used to say. He ate. God help him, he ate that heel of stale cornbread like it was the finest meal he'd had in his entire life. And some shameful, honest part of him understood that it might actually be true. That nothing on his own table back home, none of the roasts or the imported wine or the desserts his cook spent 2 days preparing had ever tasted like this, because none of it had ever been given to him. It had all been served. There was a difference, he was discovering, a difference his body understood even before his mind caught up to it. While he ate, a child appeared in the doorway. A girl, maybe 8 years old, thin in the way that worried Silas more than his own hunger had, watching him with the open, unguarded curiosity of a kid who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. "Mama, is he going to stay?" "Go on inside, Mary Beth," Evelyn said, but there wasn't much heat in it. "I don't mind the question," Silas said, glancing at the girl. "No, I'm not staying, little miss, just passing through. Your mama's been kind enough to feed a hungry stranger, is all." "We don't got much to spare," the girl said, with the blunt honesty only children manage. "But Mama says you always got something to spare if you look hard enough." Evelyn made a small sound, half exasperation, half something gentler. "Inside, Mary Beth. Supper's almost on." The girl disappeared, and Evelyn sat down on the porch step a respectful distance from him, looking out at the dying light over the cottonwoods, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You always feed strangers off your porch?" Silas asked finally. "Out here? Alone? With a child in the house? Seems like a risk." "Everybody's a risk," Evelyn said. "Man comes to your door, you can turn him away hungry and hope he goes off and finds trouble somewhere else, or you can feed him and pray he was worth feeding. I've done both ways. Feeding's worked out better mostly." She paused. "Not always, but mostly." "And the times it didn't?" Something closed in her face, briefly, like a window shutting against weather. "Those are my business," she said, not unkindly, but final. "You asked for water and bread, Silas. I gave you what I had. Doesn't mean I owe you my whole life story along with it." He nodded, accepting the boundary, and something about the way she drew it, clean, without apology, without performing politeness she didn't feel, struck him harder than he expected. Back home, everyone gave him everything he asked for, and more, falling over themselves to volunteer information he hadn't even requested, hoping the oversharing would earn them some favor. This woman, who had nothing, who'd given him her own family's bread without being asked twice, drew a line plain as a fence post and expected him to respect it. He did. "That barn door," he said instead, nodding toward it. "I noticed the hinge. I've got some skill with my hands. Let me look at it before I move on, at least. Feels wrong to eat a meal and ride off without earning some part of it." Evelyn studied him a moment, the same sharp assessment from earlier. Suit yourself. Tools are in the barn. Mind the back hinge. It's rusted clean through, might come apart on you if you're not careful. He spent the better part of an hour on that hinge, working by the fading light, and then by a lantern Evelyn brought out without him asking, set down within reach, and then taken away again without comment. His hands, soft from decades of signing papers and shaking hands at cattle auctions, blistered within the first 20 minutes. He kept working anyway. There was something in the simple physical honesty of the task, a problem with a solution he could see and reach and fix with his own two hands, that felt cleaner than anything he'd done in years. By the time he finished, full dark had settled over the valley, and his shoulders ached in a way that told him he'd be feeling this in the morning, and probably for several mornings after. Evelyn came out to inspect the work, holding the lantern up to check the hinge, swinging the door once, twice, testing the weight of it. "That's good work," she said, sounding faintly surprised. "Better than my husband ever managed on it, and he was a carpenter before he was a rancher. I had a good teacher once," Silas said, which was true in its way, true enough that he didn't have to explain. It was a teacher who'd worked for him 40 years ago, a ranch hand named Otis, who'd shown a young Silas Granger how to fix things with his hands, before Silas got rich enough to pay other people to do it instead. "You're welcome to sleep in the barn tonight," Evelyn said. "Wind's picking up, and that horse of yours needs the rest more than the road does. I won't have you riding a lame animal off into the dark on my account." "I don't want to be a burden." "You fixed my hinge," Evelyn said simply. "We're square. Barn's there. Take it or don't. But I'm not standing out here arguing about it all night." He took it. That first night at the Harper barn, lying on a bed of straw that should have felt like the most uncomfortable place he'd slept in decades, and somehow didn't, Silas lay awake a long time, listening to his gelding shift and settle in the stall beside him, listening to the wind work at the loose boards overhead, and turning over the day in his mind like a man examining a coin to see if it was counterfeit. He kept waiting to find the catch, the angle. The moment where Evelyn Harper's kindness revealed itself to be a transaction after all, where she'd come out in the morning and present some bill he hadn't agreed to, some expectation he hadn't been told about. It didn't come. In the morning she had coffee, weak, stretched thin, but coffee, and another heel of bread, and she didn't ask him for anything beyond what he'd already given. When he offered again to do more work before he moved on, fix what else needed fixing, earn his keep properly, she didn't argue, just handed him a list of small repairs without ceremony, the way you'd hand a task to someone you trusted to actually do it. He stayed that second day. And the day after that turned into a week, and the week turned into something neither of them named out loud, but both of them understood. Silas was no longer a passing stranger being fed out of charity. He was working the place, mending fences, helping with what little there was to harvest from the dying garden. Hauling water from the well that was sinking lower every week, the drought dragged on. In exchange, Evelyn fed him, gave him the barn to sleep in, and treated him with a plain, unromantic decency that he found himself hungrier for than he'd ever been for food. It was on the 9th night, sitting at her small kitchen table for the first time instead of eating alone on the porch step, with Mary Beth already asleep in the back room and a single candle burning low between them, that Evelyn finally asked him the question he'd been dreading. "Where's your family, Silas? A man your age, alone on the road? Somewhere's got to be wondering where you went." He thought about lying outright. He thought about telling the truth. He landed somewhere in between, the way he had with his name that first evening. Not a lie exactly, just a careful arrangement of true things that left out the parts that mattered most. "I had a wife," he said. "She passed some years back. Fever." That much was true. "No children that lived." Also true, though it left out the 11 empty rooms, the ranch, the 12,000 head of cattle that had no one to inherit them but a cousin he barely knew. "I've been on my own a long while now, decided it was past time to see something of the world besides the same 4 walls I'd been staring at for years." Evelyn studied him across the candlelight, and for a moment he thought she could see straight through him, see the lie folded up inside the truth like a knife inside a coat. "That's a sad way to live," she said finally. "Alone like that. No wonder you look at Mary Beth the way you do." "How do I look at her?" "Like you're memorizing something," Evelyn said, "in case you don't get to see it again." He didn't have an answer for that. It was, He realized with something close to alarm, exactly right. The weeks that followed taught Silas Granger things about honest labor that 62 years of owning a ranch had somehow never managed to teach him. He'd always thought of himself as a working man at heart. Hadn't he started with nothing? Hadn't he built the Granger empire with his own grit? But there was a vast, humbling distance between directing the work of 100 ranch hands from a comfortable porch and actually doing the work himself, day after day, with his own aching back and his own blistered hands and his own body bearing the full weight of every task. He learned what it felt like to fall into a straw bed at night, so exhausted that sleep took him before he'd finished a single worried thought. He learned the particular satisfaction of a fence mended right, a roof patched so it wouldn't leak through another season, a well pump coaxed back into working order with nothing but patience and a borrowed wrench. He learned, too, the particular helplessness of standing in a dying garden with Evelyn, both of them looking at rows of beans curling brown at the edges, knowing that no amount of sweat or care was going to bring rain that simply wasn't coming. The drought had the whole valley by the throat by then. Silas had seen drought before, of course, had weathered 3 or 4 bad seasons across his decades of ranching, but he'd weathered them from a position of such cushioned wealth that the suffering of it had always stayed somewhat abstract to him, a column of numbers in a ledger, rather than a felt thing in his bones. Out here, with no cushion at all, he watched the drought become something else entirely. He watched it become children with hollow cheeks. He watched it become old men selling off the last of their stock for half its worth because they couldn't feed it through another dry month. He watched it become a kind of slow, grinding fear that sat behind everyone's eyes in the small town nearby, a town called Millbrook that Evelyn rode into every other week for what little supplies she could afford. And he watched Evelyn Harper, who had less than almost anyone in that valley, give away pieces of the little she had with a regularity that started to genuinely alarm him. It began small. A neighbor's boy, maybe 10 years old, showing up at the Harper place one afternoon with a face gone gray from hunger, and Evelyn sitting him down at her own table and feeding him a bowl of the thin stew that was supposed to be supper for herself and Mary Beth. And lately, Silas, too. She didn't make a show of it. She didn't even mention it to Silas afterward. He only found out because he'd been coming up from the barn and seen the boy through the window, seen Evelyn's face as she watched him eat, an expression of such fierce, unguarded tenderness that Silas had to stop walking for a moment, out there in the yard, and just look at her. It happened again 2 days later. And again the week after that. A different child this time. A girl from a family 3 farms over whose father had gone into Millbrook looking for work that didn't exist and hadn't come back yet. "You can't keep doing that," Silas finally said to her, one evening after a third hungry child had come and gone from the porch, with a share of food that left precious little for the household itself. "Evelyn, you're stretching what little you have thinner every week. You've got Mary Beth to think of." "You think I don't think of her?" Evelyn's voice had an edge to it he hadn't heard before, sharp and tired at once. "You think it doesn't cost me something, watching her go to bed a little hungrier some nights because I gave away part of supper to somebody else's child? It costs me plenty, Silas. But I look at that boy's face, or that girl's face, and I think about what it would mean for somebody to turn Mary Beth away hungry if it was the other way around, and I can't do it. I can't be the kind of person who has a little extra and keeps it all for herself while a child 2 farms over goes to bed crying from hunger. I'd rather we all go a little hungry together than I be comfortable while somebody else's kid starves." "That's not sustainable," Silas said, and heard, even as he said it, how much it sounded like something a banker would say, something Tom Reeve might say going over the ranch ledgers, a cold, practical word dropped into a conversation that deserved something warmer. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression made him feel, for the first time since he'd arrived at her porch, with a thin coat and a half-truth of a name, genuinely seen, and not in a flattering way. "You talk sometimes," she said slowly, "like a man who's used to thinking about things in terms of what's sustainable, like a man who's run numbers on things. That's an odd way for a drifter to talk." His heart went still in his chest. "I had some schooling once," he said, which was true, though it left out the rest. "Before things went bad for me." She seemed to accept it, or at least to let it go, but he was noticing more and more, the longer he stayed, that she watched him sometimes with a particular thoughtful look, like a woman cataloging small inconsistencies and filing them away for later. The way you'd note a crack in a foundation that wasn't causing trouble yet, but might, eventually, if the weather turned bad enough. That night, lying in the barn with the geldings breathing slow and even in the stall beside him, Silas reached into the lining of his coat where the rest of his $40 sat, along with, though he'd never told Evelyn this, never told anyone in the valley this, a folded letter authorizing him to draw on accounts in 3 different banks if he needed to. He could end this. He could end all of it tomorrow. He could ride into Millbrook, send word to Tom Reeve, and within a week there'd be enough money flowing into this valley to drown the drought itself in relief. Feed for the cattle, supplies for every struggling family, medicine for every sick child, water hauled in by the wagon load if it came to that. And the moment he did, Evelyn Harper would never look at him the same way again. He understood that with a clarity that frightened him. The moment she learned that the ragged stranger she'd fed out of her own family's scarcity was actually Silas Granger, one of the richest men on the frontier, every single thing she'd given him. The bread, the water, the barn to sleep in, the plain, unguarded kindness she extended to him daily without asking what it cost her to do it. Every bit of it would curdle in her memory into something else. Pity, maybe, redirected at herself. Embarrassment. Or worse, anger. The particular fury of someone who realizes they've been watched and tested and found worthy by a man who never once told them the rules of the test. He didn't know how to hold both of those truths at once. The valley dying of thirst around him, and the one honest relationship of his entire adult life sitting fragile as a held breath, dependent on a lie he couldn't bring himself to undo. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He stayed quiet, and he stayed put. And he worked the Harper place from sunup to sundown, and he watched the drought tighten its grip on the valley week after week, and he carried his secret like a stone in his coat pocket that grew heavier every single day he didn't put it down. It was Mary Beth, in the end, who came closest to cracking him open, though she had no idea she was doing it. She'd taken to following Silas around the property in the late afternoons, after her chores and before supper, asking him a string of questions with the relentless curiosity particular to children who haven't yet learned that some questions make grown-ups uncomfortable. Where had he traveled? What was the biggest town he'd ever seen? Did he have any children of his own, anywhere, that he missed? That last question caught him off guard one evening while he was working on a section of fence that had come loose, and he found himself answering more honestly than he meant to. "No children," he said. "Wanted them once. My wife and I tried for years. Didn't happen for us." "That's sad," Mary Beth said, with the blunt sympathy of an 8-year-old. "You'd have made a good papa, I think. You fixed our hinge real good, and you don't yell even when things go wrong, like when the mule kicked over the water bucket and you just laughed instead of getting mad." Something in Silas's chest twisted hard at that. "Thank you for saying so," he managed. "Mama says you're a good man," Mary Beth went on, swinging on the fence post beside him, oblivious to the effect her words were having. "She told Mrs. Calloway in town you're the hardest worker she's seen since Papa died, and the most honest, too." She paused, considering. "Are you honest, Mr. Silas?" The question hung there in the gold evening light, simple and devastating. "I try to be," he said, which was, he realized even as the words left his mouth, the closest thing to a true answer he'd given anyone in this valley since the day he arrived. "I don't always manage it as well as I'd like." "Nobody does," Mary Beth said, with the easy wisdom of a child repeating something she'd heard an adult say. "Mama says that's why honesty matters more for the hard things than the easy ones. Anybody can be honest about easy stuff." She hopped down off the fence post then and ran off toward the house, leaving Silas standing alone in the fading light with her words sitting in him like a verdict he hadn't asked for but couldn't argue with. Anybody can be honest about easy stuff. He thought about the letter folded into the lining of his coat. He thought about Tom Reeve back at the ranch, surely worried sick by now, surely wondering if his employer of 30 years had gotten himself killed somewhere on a fool's errand. He thought about the irrigation canal that ran along the eastern edge of his own property, the one that fed off the river before it ever reached this dying valley, the one his own engineers had built 15 years ago to make sure Granger land never wanted for water even in the worst seasons, water that could, with a single turn key, be redirected to save every dying farm between here and Millbrook. He thought about all of it, standing there in his second-hand boots with blistered hands and a stranger's name. And for the first time since he'd ridden away from his 11-room house before sunrise all those weeks ago, he understood that this experiment of his, this search to find out if kindness still existed in the world without money attached to it, had stopped being an experiment a long time back. It had become his actual life, the realest one he'd ever lived. And he had no earthly idea how to keep it from ending the moment the truth came out, the way he now understood, with a dread settling cold and certain in his stomach that it eventually would have to. That night he didn't sleep at all. He lay in the straw listening to the wind worry at the barn boards, listening to his horses breathing, listening to the far-off sound of dry thunder rolling across a sky that hadn't given up a single drop of rain in going on 3 months. And he understood that the valley was running out of time in a way that no amount of waiting, no amount of careful silence was going to solve. Something was going to have to break. He just didn't yet know it would be him who broke it open, alone, before sunrise, with a key in his coat pocket and a decision he could never take back. The thunder that rolled dry across the valley that night kept its promise of nothing. Morning came up, hot and white and empty of clouds, and Silas walked out of the barn with his eyes burning from no sleep, and found Evelyn already at the well, hauling up a bucket that came up showing more mud than water. She looked at the bucket a long moment before she set it down. "Quarter what it was giving a month ago," she said, not really to him, more to herself, the way a person talks when they're doing arithmetic they don't want to finish. 2 months at this rate, maybe less. And after that? After that, we haul from the river crossing, 3 miles each way, however long that holds out, too. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him, and there was something flat and tired in her face that he hadn't seen there before, not even in the worst of the weeks prior. "You don't have to stay for this part, Silas. I mean that kindly. A man passing through, he's got no obligation to sit and watch a valley die of thirst." "I'm not passing through anymore," he said. "Haven't been for a while now." She studied him, and for a moment he thought she might ask him the question he most dreaded. Ask him outright why a drifter with schooling in his voice and a stranger's caution about his own name had decided to plant himself on a dying homestead with no payment and no end date. But she didn't ask it. She picked the bucket back up instead and said, "Come on then. Mary Beth's got a fever started this morning. I want to get her settled before I ride into Millbrook for what little the apothecary's got left." That single sentence rearranged something in Silas's chest. A fever. Bad? Don't know yet. Started in the night. She's hot, but she's talking sense, so it's not the worst kind. Not yet. Evelyn's voice had gone careful, the voice of a woman holding panic at arm's length by main force. "I lost a baby to fever once, before Mary Beth came along. I don't intend to lose her too, but I also don't have money for the kind of medicine that does any good fast. So I'll take what Doc Aldridge can spare on credit and pray the rest of it sorts itself." She didn't say pray to anyone in particular. It was just the word people reached for out here, the way you'd reach for any tool you had on hand when the one you actually needed wasn't available. Silas followed her into the house, where Mary Beth lay in the narrow bed in the back room, her face flushed and her eyes glassy, but her voice steady enough when she said, "Mr. Silas, I don't feel so good," in a tone that was more annoyed than frightened, which was somehow worse, because it told him she didn't yet understand how bad this could get. "I know, little miss," Silas said, crouching by the bed. "Your mama's going to fetch something for it. You just rest easy till she's back." "Will you stay with me? Mama's got to go to town." "I'll stay right here," he said, and meant it with a fullness that surprised him. Tim. Evelyn rode out within the hour, taking the family's one horse, a sway-backed mare that had seen better decades, and leaving Silas alone in the house with a sick child and an afternoon that stretched out long and frightening in front of him. He sat by Mary Beth's bed and wet a cloth from what little clean water remained and laid it across her forehead, and he talked to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, the way he remembered his own mother talking to him once, decades back, when he'd been a sick child himself in a house with dirt floors and no money at all, long before any of the Granger fortune existed. It struck him, sitting there, that he hadn't thought about that house in years. He'd built so much distance between the boy he'd been and the man he'd become that the boy had practically stopped existing in his own memory. And here he was, gone right back to him, sitting on a hard chair beside a sick girl's bed, with nothing in his pockets that could fix this faster than waiting could, nothing except the money sewn into his coat. Nothing except the letter from his banks. Nothing except the fact that if he rode hard for Millbrook himself, right now, he could walk into any business in that town and simply buy whatever medicine existed, no credit needed, no rationing, and have it back here inside 2 hours instead of however long it took Evelyn's tired old mare to make the round trip on a fever-soaked errand of mercy. He sat with that thought a long while, turning it over. In the end, he didn't do it. Not because the impulse to help wasn't screaming at him to act. It was, louder than almost anything had screamed at him in years, but because he understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that the moment he showed up, flush with money and easy answers, the careful fiction he'd built would collapse, and Evelyn would have every right to wonder what else about him had been a lie, right in the middle of the worst fright of her life, with her daughter sick in the next room. That wasn't a burden he had any right to add to her plate today. So he stayed where he was, useless in the way that mattered most and present in the only way he was allowed to be, and he waited. Evelyn came back 2 hours later, sun-flushed and breathing hard, with a small paper packet of powder from Doc Aldrich and a face gone tight with worry that didn't ease even after she saw Mary Beth was still talking sense, still arguing weakly that she wasn't tired even though her eyes kept sliding shut. "Doc says it's probably just a summer fever, going around some of the children in town too," Evelyn said, mixing the powder into water with hands that weren't quite steady. "Said to watch for it turning worse, but if it's what he thinks it is, she should break it in a day or two." "And if it doesn't break?" Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Then I'll worry about that when it happens. Worrying about it now doesn't help her any." She got the medicine into Mary Beth, who made a face at the taste but swallowed it, and then Evelyn sat down hard on the chair Silas vacated for her, suddenly looking every one of her years and then some. "Doc Aldrich says there's 3 other children in town with the same fever," she said quietly, once Mary Beth had drifted into an uneasy sleep. "And he's almost out of the powder that treats it. Said if more come down sick, he doesn't know what he'll do for them." "Why's he low? Supply trouble?" "Drought's why everything's low," Evelyn said. "Wagons aren't coming through like they used to. Roads are bad. River crossings near dry. Freight costs more than half the folks around here can pay even when the goods do arrive. It's not just water we're short on, Silas. It's everything water touches, which by now is about everything there is." She put her face in her hands for a moment, just a moment, the only time Silas had seen her come close to breaking since he'd arrived at her porch all those weeks back. "I'm so tired," she said, muffled into her palms. "I'm so tired of fighting this ground for every single thing it used to give us free." Silas sat across from her, and the urge to reach out, to put a hand over hers, rose up in him strong enough that he had to consciously hold himself still. It wasn't his place. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on how this all eventually unraveled. "You're not fighting it alone," he said instead. "Not anymore." Evelyn lifted her face from her hands and looked at him, and something passed between them in that look. Something neither of them named. Something that had been building slow and quiet across the weeks of fence mending and shared meals and small daily kindnesses. Something that scared Silas more than the lie he was carrying, because it meant the lie now had the power to hurt 2 people instead of 1. "You're a strange man, Silas," she said softly. "I don't know half of what's true about you, but I know you've worked this place like it was your own, and I know you sat with my sick girl all afternoon without being asked, and I know that counts for something. Whatever else might not add up." He almost told her. Right there, in that small kitchen, with the afternoon light going gold through the window and Mary Beth's fever finally easing into sleep down the hall. The truth sat right at the front of his teeth, ready to come out. What stopped him wasn't cowardice, exactly. Or it was, but it wasn't only that. It was the certainty that the truth, delivered today, on top of a sick child and an empty well and a town running short on medicine, would land like one more disaster in a week already too heavy with them. He told himself he'd find a better day, a calmer one. He told himself that more than once over the days that followed, and every time the day in question turned out to have its own crisis demanding attention first, and the truth kept getting pushed back week over week until it had been pushed back so many times that telling it at all started to feel like its own kind of impossible. Mary Beth's fever broke after 2 days, same as Doc Aldrich predicted, and the household exhaled with a relief that Silas felt almost as deeply as Evelyn did. But the valley itself showed no sign of breaking its own fever. The drought ground on through the following weeks with a patience that felt almost deliberate, almost cruel, like the sky itself had decided to test exactly how much a place could endure before it simply gave up. The well dropped further. The garden, what was left of it, finally surrendered entirely. Even the stubborn beans curled black and brittle in a single bad week of heat that didn't break even at night. Evelyn started rationing what little they had with a grim, practiced efficiency that told Silas this wasn't the first hard season she'd weathered, even if it might be the worst. Word came through Millbrook, carried by a traveling peddler who stopped briefly at the Harper place to trade a few needles for a meal, that 2 ranches further up the valley had already given up entirely, packed what stock survived onto wagons, and headed east, looking for grass and water somewhere the drought hadn't reached. The peddler said it like gossip, like an interesting bit of news to trade alongside his needles, but Silas watched Evelyn's face go pale and still when she heard it. "The Hendersons," she said quietly, after the peddler moved on. "They've worked that land 30 years, longer than I've been alive." She looked out toward the dead garden, the cracked earth, the cottonwoods that had given up their leaves entirely now, standing bare and gray against a sky that refused to deliver rain. "If they're done, Silas, the rest of us aren't far behind. We're not stronger than the Hendersons were. We've just maybe got a little less to lose, so it takes longer to notice we've lost it." That night, Silas couldn't sleep again, and this time it wasn't only guilt keeping him awake. It was arithmetic, the cold, practical kind he'd spent 40 years getting good at, running itself relentlessly through his mind whether he wanted it to or not. He knew exactly how much water sat behind the gate of the Granger irrigation canal, 15 miles east as the crow flew, maybe 20 by the actual roads. He knew the canal had been built generous on purpose, built to weather exactly this kind of drought without ever once threatening Granger land, because that was what money bought you out here. Insulation, the kind so complete you could forget entirely that other people lived without it. He knew, too, that the canal gate had exactly one key, and that key sat right now in a locked drawer in his own ranch house, 15 or 20 miles away, in a house currently occupied by nobody but a worried foreman and a skeleton staff waiting for their employer to either come home or send word he wasn't going to. He could solve this. The thought arrived in him with such force that he actually sat up in the straw, heart hammering, fully awake in the dark. He could solve every part of this: Evelyn's well, the Hendersons' ruined land, the dying gardens up and down the whole valley, with a single ride home and a single turned key. The Granger Canal could redirect enough water to flood this entire valley back to life inside of a week. But solving it meant admitting who he was. There was no version of secretly fixing a drought that didn't eventually require explaining where the water came from and who had the authority to send it. He lay back down in the straw and stared up at the dark shape of the barn rafters, and turned the problem over and over, looking for some angle that let him save the valley without losing what he'd found inside it. And he didn't find one. Not that night, not the night after either, or the one after that, even as the drought kept tightening and the Hendersons' empty land stood as a silent, ugly warning of where this was all heading if nobody intervened. It was a conversation with Tom Reeve, or rather, a conversation Silas had with himself imagining what Tom Reeve would say, that finally cracked the problem open, though not in the direction he expected. He'd been thinking these past weeks in terms of 2 choices only: stay silent and let the valley suffer, or reveal himself and lose Evelyn's trust forever. But lying in the barn one particularly restless night, he found himself imagining Tom's voice, dry and practical as it always was, cutting straight through the false binary he'd trapped himself in. "You're thinking about this like it's about you, Silas," the imagined Tom said. "Like the only 2 outcomes that matter are how Evelyn Harper feels about your name. There's a whole valley of people who don't know your name at all and don't much care, who just like some water for their crops. You want to keep playing poor man a while longer? Fine, that's your business. But find a way to get the water moving that doesn't require you standing in the middle of the road announcing who you are." The thought sat with him for the rest of that sleepless night, turning itself over. And by morning he had something close to a plan, incomplete, risky, the kind of plan that would have made his lawyer go pale if he'd said it out loud. But a plan all the same. He didn't need to tell Evelyn anything yet. He didn't even need to tell the valley anything yet. What he needed to do was ride to his own ranch quietly, under cover of the same anonymity that had carried him this far, and open that canal gate himself, in the dark, before anyone, including his own staff, had a chance to ask him a single question about why a man who looked like a drifter was standing at the Granger irrigation controls in the middle of the night. It was reckless. It was, by any sober accounting, a terrible idea. The kind of plan a desperate man makes when he's spent too many sleepless nights chasing an impossible solution and finally lands on the first one that lets him sleep at all. But it solved the immediate problem in front of him, which was water, real water, flowing into a dying valley before one more family packed up and left for good, the way the Hendersons had. The rest of it, the explaining, the reckoning, the moment Evelyn would inevitably learn exactly who'd been sleeping in her barn all these weeks. He told himself he'd face when it came. He'd find a way. He always had. In business. In every hard negotiation of his life. He told himself this was no different. He told Evelyn the next morning that he needed to ride out for a few days. He didn't lie about much, said he had some business from his old life that needed settling, some unfinished matter he'd been putting off. It was true enough in its way that he could say it without his voice giving him away. Evelyn's face did something complicated when he said it. A flicker of worry, quickly smoothed over, replaced with the careful neutrality of a woman who'd learned not to ask men too many questions about where they went or why. "You'll come back?" she asked, and there was something underneath the question that she didn't quite let surface, something that made his chest ache to hear. "I'll come back," he said. "I give you my word on that, Evelyn. Whatever else you find out about me down the road, and there's things you don't know, I won't pretend otherwise. I'm not the kind of man who says he'll come back and then doesn't." She studied him a long moment, and something in her seemed to decide to trust him anyway, even with the warning folded into his promise. "Mary Beth will ask after you every day you're gone," she said. "I expect I will too, if I'm honest about it." It was the closest either of them had come to saying out loud what had been growing quietly between them across these weeks, and Silas felt the weight of it settle into him as he rode out the next morning before dawn. Not the weight of his secret this time, but the weight of something he very much did not want to lose. Riding hard toward a ranch house with 11 empty rooms that had never once, in all the years he'd lived there, felt as much like home as a leaning barn with a crooked door he'd fixed himself. He reached the outskirts of Grangerland 2 days later, sunburned and saddle-sore, and approached his own ranch the way a thief might, staying off the main road, skirting the edges of property he technically owned outright. All so that no one would see Silas Granger arrive looking like exactly the kind of man his own hands would once have turned away from the gate without a second thought. The canal sat exactly where he remembered it, 15 years of his own money and engineering holding back enough water to drown a small kingdom, all of it locked behind a single iron gate with a single lock that only one key in the world opened. A key that, as it happened, he'd carried in the lining of his coat the entire time, ever since the morning he rode away from his own front porch. Some old habitual caution that had felt foolish at the time and now felt, standing here in the dark with his hand closing around the cold iron of the gate mechanism, like the only piece of foresight that had ever truly mattered. He didn't let himself hesitate. He turned the key, and the great wheel of the gate mechanism groaned under his hands, stiff from disuse, and somewhere deep in the structure of the canal he heard the water begin to move, a low building rush, distant at first and then gathering. The sound of 15 years of careful, selfish abundance finally being let loose toward a valley that had been dying of thirst while it sat there, untouched, behind a locked gate with his name on the deed. He stood there a long while in the dark, listening to that sound, water rushing free for the first time in years toward people who had no idea where it was coming from or why, and he felt something in his chest crack open that had been sealed shut since the night he stood on his own porch, and realized nobody at his table would grieve him. He had no way of knowing, standing there in the cold dark with the canal roaring open behind him, that this single act, born of guilt and love and a desperate need to fix what he couldn't fix any other way, was about to unravel every careful thread of the life he'd built in that valley, and that by the time the sun came up over the Harper homestead, the woman he'd come to love more than he'd ever loved his own fortune would already be putting together pieces of a truth he'd spent 2 months trying to outrun. By the time the first gray light came up over the canal, Silas was already riding hard away from it, keeping to the same back trails he'd used coming in, his coat soaked through with sweat and his heart still hammering from the sound of all that water breaking loose behind him. He didn't stop to watch it travel. He didn't need to. He could feel it in his chest the way you feel a decision you can't take back. a thing already moving in the world beyond your reach to call it home again. He made it back onto the main road by mid-morning, bone-tired, and that was when he saw the first sign that the water had already done its work faster than he expected. The road itself, dry and cracked for 2 months running, showed a dark, wet line running alongside it now, the ditch grass already standing up, greener than it had any right to look after one night. A boy on a mule passed him going the other direction, hollering something half to himself and half to the world in general about the river finally coming back, and Silas had to look away so the boy wouldn't see whatever was on his face. He pushed the gelding as hard as he dared and reached the outskirts of Millbrook by early afternoon, and the town was already alive with a particular kind of noise he hadn't heard there before. Not the flat, worn-down murmur of a place braced for one more bad day, but something closer to excitement. Men gathered outside the feed store talking fast and loud. A woman crying openly on her porch with her hands pressed to her face. Not from grief this time, but from something like disbelief. "Water's up at the river crossing," a man told another, loud enough for Silas to catch as he rode past. "Up near 2 feet overnight. Nobody can figure where it's coming from. Ain't rained a drop in this whole county." Silas kept riding, didn't stop, didn't let his face show anything, and he told himself the not knowing would hold a while yet. People didn't go looking too hard at a gift, not when the gift was water, and the alternative was watching your land die for one more season. He told himself that all the way back to the Harper place, and he almost believed it. Evelyn was at the well when he rode in, and even from a distance he could see something different in the way she stood there. Not hauling up mud-thick buckets the way she had been for weeks, but standing back from the well entirely, looking instead at something else, something running along the low ground at the edge of her property that hadn't been there when he left. A stream. Thin but real, cutting fresh through ground that had been bone-dry for 2 months, glittering stupid and beautiful in the afternoon sun. "Silas!" She turned when she heard the gelding, and her face was lit up in a way he hadn't seen on her before. Not once in all the weeks he'd known her, something almost childlike in its relief. "Silas, look, the river's come up. Somebody upstream must have broken a dam loose, or I don't know what it is, but it's real. I've tasted it myself. It's clean, and it's running, and Mary Beth's already out there with her feet in it like a fool." She was laughing. He hadn't heard her laugh before either, not properly, not like this, and it landed on him harder than almost anything else had in the whole 2 months he'd spent in this valley, because he knew exactly what it had cost to buy that sound out of her, and he knew she didn't know it yet, and some ugly, frightened part of him wanted to just let her keep not knowing, forever, if he could manage it. "That's good news," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, thin and careful. "Good news." Evelyn shook her head, still smiling, wiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist. "Silas, it's more than good news. It might be the difference between this valley living and dying. I don't care where it came from, I'm just grateful it came at all." He should have told her right then. He knew it even as the moment passed him by. Knew it with the same clear, cold certainty he'd felt standing at the canal gate the night before. But Mary Beth came running up from the stream just then, soaked to the knees and shrieking with laughter, and the moment closed over itself, and Silas let it close, telling himself there'd be a better time, the same lie he'd been telling himself for weeks now, except this time the lie had an expiration date on it that he simply hadn't reckoned yet. The expiration date arrived 3 days later, in the shape of a man named Garrett Voss, riding into Millbrook on a fine bay horse with a Granger brand stamped plain on its flank, asking around at the general store, the saloon, and finally the sheriff's office about who in this valley might know anything about an unauthorized opening of the Granger irrigation canal 2 nights prior. Silas didn't see this happen. He heard about it secondhand, the way everyone in that valley heard about most things, through the slow churn of gossip that moved from porch to porch, faster than any actual news could travel by wire. He was splitting wood behind the Harper barn when Evelyn came around the corner with a strange look on her face, the kind of look that told him before she said a single word that something had shifted. "There's a man in town," she said, asking questions about the water. "Says he works for the Granger Ranch. Says somebody opened their canal gate without authorization. Sent the whole valley's worth of water down here without anybody's leave, and Mr. Granger himself wants to know who did it and why." Silas's hands went still on the axe handle. "Did he say why that mattered?" he said carefully. "If the water's helping everybody?" "Sheriff says it's a legal matter, not a charity one. Says water rights upstream belong to whoever owns the land the canal sits on, and that man can choose to share it or not share it as he pleases, same as he could choose to give away his own cattle or not. Opening that gate without him saying so is the same as somebody walking onto Granger land and taking cattle they didn't own. Evelyn's brow furrowed. Seems an odd thing to get angry about, water flowing to folks who needed it bad as we did. But I suppose rich men think different about owning things than the rest of us do. Maybe, Silas said, and the word came out rough. Evelyn looked at him a moment longer than felt comfortable. Something working behind her eyes that he couldn't read yet, though he would understand later, much later, replaying this exact moment in his mind more times than he could count, that this was the instant the first thread of suspicion had caught in her. "You went and settled business, you said," she said slowly. 2 days before the water came. Rode east, if I recall. Same direction as Granger land, if the map in Doc Aldridge's office is anything to go by. Lots of folks ride east, Silas said, and hated himself for the evasion even as it left his mouth. Evelyn didn't push it further. Not then. She turned and went back toward the house, and Silas stood there with the axe in his hands and the wood half split, and a feeling in his gut like the floor had gone soft beneath him, like he was standing on ground that had already started giving way and just hadn't finished falling yet. Garrett Voss found his way to the Harper place 2 days after that, riding up the same dirt track Silas had ridden up 2 months before, though Voss came in a clean coat and a good hat and an air of a man used to being listened to the moment he opened his mouth. Silas saw him coming from a distance and felt his whole body go cold. He knew Garrett Voss, had known him for nearly 15 years. The man had started as a junior clerk in the Granger ranch office and worked his way up to chief manager through nothing but stubborn competence and absolute loyalty, the kind of loyalty that meant he wouldn't stop looking for his employer until he found him, dead or alive, however long it took. There was nowhere to hide. Silas was out by the fence line when Voss rode up, and Voss's eyes swept the property once, professionally, the way a man does who's spent his whole life assessing land and stock at a glance. And then those eyes landed on Silas, and Silas watched recognition arrive on Garrett Voss's face like a slow sunrise, disbelief giving way to certainty, giving way to something like relief so profound the man nearly fell off his horse getting down from it. "Mr. Granger," Voss's voice cracked on it. "Lord above, sir, we thought Tom's had riders out searching 3 counties. We thought you might be—" "Garrett," Silas's voice came out low, urgent, his eyes flicking past Voss toward the house, where he could see Evelyn had come out onto the porch at the sound of a stranger's voice, her hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, too far to hear yet, but not for long. "Garrett, not here. Not like this." But it was already too late. He could see it happening even as he tried to stop it. Voss, still flooded with relief, still operating on instinct rather than thought, calling out loud enough to carry across the whole yard, "Sir, the whole ranch has been worried sick. Tom's going to want to know straight away that you're alive and well, and we still need to sort out this business with the canal gate. The investigation's already—" Every word landed on Evelyn's porch like a stone through glass. Silas watched her face change from a distance, watched the confusion arrive first, then the slow, terrible arithmetic of putting pieces together. "Sir, Mr. Granger, the ranch, the canal." Watched her hand drop from her eyes and her whole body go very still in a way that was somehow worse than if she'd come running down off that porch shouting. He left Voss standing by the fence and walked toward the house, and every step felt like walking toward a verdict he already knew the shape of. "Evelyn, Granger." She said it flat, testing the word, like she was checking it against everything she thought she knew, and finding it didn't fit no matter which way she turned it. "Silas Granger. That's the name on the bank in Millbrook. That's the name on half the land between here and the territory line." Her voice climbed, not loud yet, but tight, strung high with something that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be fury or grief. "That's the name on the canal that man's asking about, the one that opened up 2 days before the water came. I can explain—" "Can you?" It wasn't a question. "Explain to me how a man who owns half this valley spent 2 months sleeping in my barn and eating my last cornbread and letting my daughter ask him 100 questions about his life without once telling her the truth. Explain that to me, Silas, or whatever I'm supposed to call you now. It started as something else, Silas said, and he could hear how thin it sounded even as he said it, how much it sounded like exactly the kind of excuse a guilty man reaches for. I came out here because I wanted to know if people would treat me decent without knowing what I had. That's the truth, Evelyn. That's the whole truth of how this started. I never meant for it to become... To become what? Her voice cracked now, finally, the fury and the grief arriving together. To become real? Is that what you're telling me? That somewhere in your little experiment, it stopped being a game and started being real? And you just... what? Forgot to mention it? Forgot to tell the woman feeding you out of her own family's scarcity that you had thousands of acres and a fortune sitting behind you the entire time, that you could have fixed this drought with a letter and a stamp any week you wanted to? I didn't want it to be about money, Silas said. Not between us. I don't care what you wanted. Evelyn's voice had gone dangerously quiet now, which was worse than the shouting. I sat at my table and told you things I haven't told another living soul since my husband died. I let my daughter get attached to you. I let myself... She stopped herself there, hard, like she'd nearly said something she wasn't willing to give him. Not now, not after this. And the whole time you were watching me, testing me. Was that what it was, Silas? Was I just a test you were running, same as everybody else you must have tried before you landed on my porch? You weren't a test. His voice broke on it, raw in a way he hadn't let it be in front of her before. You were the only thing in 2 months on that road that felt true. Everything else I found out there was either cruel or it was a transaction. You were neither. You gave me bread you couldn't spare, and you never once asked what I'd give you back for it. That's not something a man tests for, Evelyn. That's something he finds, if he's lucky enough. And I was lucky enough, and I didn't know how to hold on to it without losing it the second you knew the truth. So I kept not telling you, day after day, and I know now that was a coward's choice, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend it wasn't. The yard had gone very quiet. Garrett Voss stood frozen by the fence, clearly understanding he'd walked into something far larger than a business matter, and equally clearly understanding there was no graceful way to extract himself from it now. Mary Beth had come out onto the porch behind her mother, small and confused, looking between the two adults with the particular dread of a child who understands something terrible is happening without understanding its shape yet. "Mama?" she said. "Mr. Silas, is he in trouble?" Evelyn didn't answer her daughter right away. She was looking at Silas with an expression that had moved past anger, now into something colder and more final, something that frightened him far more than her fury had. "The water," she said slowly. "You opened that gate yourself. That's what Voss came to ask about. You rode out, you said you had business to settle, and what you actually did was open your own canal in secret, in the dark, without telling anybody, including me. I didn't know how else to fix it," Silas said. "I couldn't watch this valley die, Evelyn, not when I had it in my power to stop it. I couldn't tell you who I was and ask permission, because the moment I told you, I knew I'd lose you. And I was selfish enough, weak enough, to choose saving the valley quietly over losing you honestly. I see now that was wrong. I should have told you the moment I understood what I felt for you. I should have told you long before that, the very first night, sitting at your porch step eating your bread. I have no defense for the silence, except that I was afraid, and fear isn't a good enough reason. I know that now, but it's the true one." For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing at all. The thin new stream at the edge of the property caught the afternoon light and glittered, indifferent to all of it, still running, still doing exactly the good it had been sent to do, regardless of the wreckage it had revealed on its way into the valley. "Get off my land, Silas," she said finally, and her voice had gone past anger entirely now, into something flat and exhausted that scared him more than shouting would have. "I don't want your money. I don't want your apology. I fed a hungry man because that's what decent people do for each other. And I'd do it again for any stranger who rode up that road tomorrow, but I won't stand here and be made a fool of in front of my own daughter by a man who let me believe a lie for 2 months because the truth was inconvenient to his feelings." "Evelyn, please." "Mama," Mary Beth said again, smaller this time, starting to cry now, without fully understanding why, just absorbing the wrongness of the air around her. "Is Mr. Silas leaving?" Evelyn's face cracked at that, just slightly, just enough for Silas to see how much this was costing her too. How much it would have been easier for her to simply stay angry without that small voice reminding her there was a child caught in the middle of two adults' wreckage. But she didn't soften toward him. If anything, her daughter's distress hardened her further, gave her one more reason to want this over and finished. "Yes," she told Mary Beth, not looking away from Silas. "Mr. Silas is leaving. Go on inside, baby. This isn't anything you need to hear." Mary Beth didn't move at first, looking between them with a child's stubborn hope that grown-ups could still fix whatever was broken if they just talked a little longer. And when neither of them gave her that hope, she finally turned and went inside, and Silas heard the small sound of her crying carry through the thin walls of the house, and something in him broke clean in half hearing it. "I'll go," he said quietly. "I won't make this harder than it already is. But I want you to know, none of it was a lie, Evelyn. Not the work, not the way I felt sitting at your table. Not 1 hour I spent on this place was me pretending to be something I wasn't. The only lie was the name. And I know that's no small thing to forgive, but everything else was as true as anything I've ever done in 62 years of living." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "Or maybe a man who can lie about one thing, that big for 2 whole months, is a man who's good enough at lying that I shouldn't trust my own judgment about what else was true. I don't know which it is, Silas, and right now I'm too tired and too hurt to spend any more of myself trying to work it out. I just need you gone." He looked at her a long moment, memorizing her face the way Mary Beth had once accused him of memorizing things he was afraid he'd never see again. And then he turned, without another word, and walked to where his gelding stood at the fence. And Garrett Voss, still frozen, still clearly wishing he'd never ridden up this particular road today, fell into step a respectful distance behind him. Neither man spoke until they were well off the Harper property, the small homestead shrinking behind them, the new stream still glittering uselessly at its edge, water that had cost Silas everything he'd actually wanted, in exchange for saving everything he hadn't fully understood he was risking. "Sir," Voss finally said, once they'd put enough distance between themselves and the house, "I am deeply sorry. I had no notion that woman was... that you'd built something there. I'd never have spoken so plainly in front of her if I'd known." "It's not your fault, Garrett." Silas's voice came out hollow. "It would have come out one way or another. I'd been borrowing time I never actually had. What do you want done about the investigation, sir?" "The canal matter. It's a simple thing to close out, given you're the owner, and it was your own water you released. A signature, maybe a word to the sheriff, and it's finished within the week." Silas was quiet a long moment, looking back over his shoulder at the homestead disappearing behind a low rise, at the thin glittering stream still doing its slow good work across a valley that would live now, would green up again come next season, would forget inside of a year or two that it had ever nearly died at all. "Close it out," he said finally. "Tell the sheriff whatever needs telling. None of it matters next to what I actually lost out here, Garrett, and there's no signature in the world that fixes that." He didn't go home that night. He couldn't make himself ride the rest of the way to the house with 11 empty rooms. Not yet. Not with the wound this fresh. Instead, he found a spot along the new stream, a mile or so from the Harper place, close enough to still feel some thin thread of connection to it. And he sat there until the sun went down and the stars came out cold and indifferent overhead, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like the only honest thing left to him, that he had gotten exactly what he'd set out 2 months ago to find. Proof. Real proof, that kindness without strings still existed in this hard world, and in the getting of it, he had managed to destroy the one place that proof had ever lived. The valley was saved. The water ran clean and free toward fields that would bloom again by summer's end. And somewhere behind him, in a small house with a mended hinge he'd fixed with his own 2 hands, a woman who'd given a stranger her last cup of water now sat with her daughter crying in the next room, wondering if anything about the 2 months past had been real at all. And Silas Granger, rich beyond almost any man's measure and emptier than he'd ever been in his entire life, had no idea, sitting alone by a stream he'd bought with the truth he was too afraid to tell sooner, whether there was any road left that led back to her forgiveness, or whether he'd simply traded one kind of loneliness for another, richer and somehow far worse than the one he'd started with. He rode home the next morning, finally, because there was nowhere else left to go, and the house with 11 rooms felt exactly as hollow as he remembered it, except now the hollowness had a name attached to it, and a face, and a small girl's voice asking if Mr. Silas was leaving. Tom Reeve met him at the door before he'd even gotten both boots inside, and whatever relief the foreman felt at seeing his employer alive and whole lasted about as long as it took to look at Silas's face. "You look like a man who buried somebody," Tom said. "Might as well have," Silas said, and didn't elaborate. And Tom, 30 years knowing when to push and when to let a thing sit, didn't ask further that night. It took 3 days before Silas told him the whole of it, sitting in the study with 2 untouched glasses of whiskey between them, the fire burned down low. Tom listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of mercy. And when Silas finished, the older man sat quiet a long while, turning his glass slowly on the desk. "So you found what you went looking for," Tom said finally. "Proof that kindness still exists out there without money attached to it. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? 2 months ago, standing in that barn, that's exactly what you told me you wanted to know." "I found it," Silas said, "and I broke it trying to protect it. There's no part of that I'd call a victory, Tom." "No," Tom agreed. "I don't expect there is." He set his glass down, untouched still. "What are you going to do about it?" "What is there to do? She told me to leave. She meant it. I've got no business riding back out there and pretending a few sweet words undo 2 months of lying to her." "Didn't ask if you had business," Tom said. "Asked what you're going to do." Silas didn't have an answer for that. Not that night. He sat in his study with the fire dying and the whiskey going warm and untouched, surrounded by 11 rooms that had never felt smaller, and he thought about Evelyn Harper's face the moment Garrett Voss said the word "sir," and he understood that there was no amount of money in any of his 3 bank accounts that was going to undo what his silence had cost. He didn't go back right away. He told himself it was respect, giving her room to breathe, room to be angry without him standing in her yard making it harder. But if he was honest with himself, lying awake those first nights back in his own feather bed, sleeping worse than he ever had on a bed of straw, some of it was plain fear. Fear that he'd ride out there and she'd meet him with the shotgun again, this time not lowering it. It was Mary Beth, in the end, who broke the standoff, though neither Silas nor Evelyn arranged it that way. Word reached him through Doc Aldridge, who came out to the Granger Ranch on an unrelated matter and mentioned, almost in passing, that the Harper girl had been asking around town whether anyone had seen the drifter who used to work their place. Asking with the persistent, uncomplicated hope of a child who didn't understand yet that some things grown-ups break can't simply be glued back together by wanting it. That was what finally got Silas back on a horse. He didn't ride up to the house this time. He'd thought hard about what arriving the same way he'd left would mean, and he understood it would mean nothing. A rich man riding up on a fine horse, the very image Evelyn had every right to distrust now. So he came on foot, the last mile of it, in the same thin coat and worn boots he'd worn the day he first knocked on her door, carrying nothing but his hat in his hands. Evelyn was at the fence line when she saw him coming, and Silas watched her whole body go rigid, watched her hand drift toward the porch, where the shotgun still leaned by the door, though she didn't go for it. "I told you to get off my land," she said, when he was close enough to hear it without her raising her voice. "You did," Silas said, "and I left. I'm not here to argue that, Evelyn. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me or to take me back or anything that requires you to feel a single thing you don't already feel. I'm here because I've got work I owe this place, and I intend to do it, with your permission or without it, though I'd a sight rather have your permission." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "What work?" "All of it. Every fence that needs mending from here to the county line, every hinge, every leak in that roof I never finished checking, every bit of labor a man with 2 working hands can offer a place that fed him when he had nothing." "I'm not offering money, Evelyn. I know better than to insult you with money. I'm offering the only thing I've got left that you might actually want from me, which is my back and my hands and as many hours of honest work as it takes for you to believe I mean a single word of it. And if I don't want it, if I tell you to take your hands and your hours and ride straight back to your ranch and leave us be, then I'll go," Silas said, "and I won't come back unless you send for me. But I had to ask first. I owed you that much. To ask, instead of deciding for you again what was best, the way I did with that canal gate. I made that mistake once already, deciding things on your behalf because I thought I knew better. I'm not going to make it twice." Evelyn studied him a long moment, the wind picking up dust around both their boots, and Silas could see her weighing something behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, some small grudging respect for the fact that he'd asked, instead of simply shown up and started swinging an axe like he owned the place, which, in a sense, he didn't say out loud. Half the valley now knew he technically could have. "The fence along the east field's been down for a week," she said finally. "Flat. Not quite a yes, but not a no either. Coyotes got into the chicken coop twice already on account of it." "I'll start there," Silas said. "I'm not feeding you," Evelyn added, sharp, before he could read too much warmth into the opening she'd just given him. You eat what you bring or what you catch yourself. I'm not putting bread on a plate for you again until I understand what that even means anymore." "Fair," Silas said, and meant it, and that was the whole of their conversation that day. He worked the east fence from sunup until the light failed and slept that night not in the barn. She hadn't offered it, and he hadn't asked, but out under the stars near the property line, on the bare ground, with nothing but his coat for warmth, the same as he'd slept plenty of nights on the road before he'd ever found her porch. It felt, in a strange way, like penance, though he didn't let himself think the word too directly, suspicious of how easily a rich man could turn even his own guilt into something performative, something designed to be witnessed and admired. But there was no one to witness it. Evelyn didn't come check on him. Mary Beth wasn't allowed near the fence line. Silas understood that without being told, understood it from the careful way the girl watched him from the porch some mornings, clearly under instruction to keep her distance, clearly confused and a little hurt by the new rule. He worked anyway, day after day. The fence got fixed, every post reset, every wire restrung tight and true. He moved on from there without being asked, to the barn roof, which had been patched so many times the patches were starting to need patching themselves. And he spent 4 days up there in the heat replacing rotted boards with lumber he'd hauled in himself from town, paid for out of his own pocket without ever telling Evelyn what it cost, because he understood by now that the moment she felt like she owed him for materials, she'd stop letting him work the place at all. He kept at it through the heat of high summer that followed the drought's break, and the valley around them came back slowly, painfully, the way land does after a long sickness. Not all at once, not in a single green burst of recovery, but in fits and stretches. A good rain here, a dry stretch there. Fields that filled in patchy before they filled in whole. He watched the Harper garden come back to life under Evelyn's hands, watched her plant new rows where the old dead ones had been, watched Mary Beth's careful, hopeful watching of him from a porch. She wasn't allowed to leave grow, week by week, into something less guarded. It was nearly a month before Evelyn said more than a handful of words to him in a day. It happened over the well, the same well where she'd hauled up mud months before. Silas had spent 2 days rebuilding the housing around it, reinforcing the walls that had started to crumble from years of neglect. And on the 3rd day, testing the new pump mechanism, clean cold water came up strong and steady for the first time since he'd arrived at this place as a starving stranger. Evelyn came out to look at it, the way she had that first morning he'd fixed the hinge, and stood there a long moment, watching the water run clear into the bucket. "You didn't have to rebuild the whole housing," she said. "I only asked you to look at the pump." "I know what you asked," Silas said. "I did the rest because it needed doing, and because I had the time, and because—" He stopped himself, then decided, after a month of careful silence, that maybe a little honesty wouldn't hurt. "Because every hour I spend fixing something on this place is an hour I get to spend near you and Mary Beth, even if you won't speak 2 words to me most days. I won't pretend that's not part of it. I'm not above wanting that." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She crouched by the bucket and touched the water with 2 fingers, testing its temperature. The simple unconscious gesture of a woman checking her own well, the way she'd done 1,000 times before drought ever touched this valley. "Mary Beth asks about you every night," she said finally, not looking at him. "Asks why she can't talk to you. I tell her it's complicated, and she tells me that's not an answer, and she's right, it isn't." She stood, wiping her wet fingers on her apron. "I don't know what to do with you, Silas. I see you out there every day, working like a man with something to prove, and some part of me wants to believe it means what it looks like it means. And then I remember the 2 months before, and I think, a man that good at hiding the truth, how would I even know if I was being fooled all over again?" "You wouldn't," Silas admitted. "Not from words. I could tell you 100 things right now about how sorry I am, how much I meant every honest moment we had, and none of it would prove anything you could trust, because words are cheap, and I've already shown you mine don't always carry what they should. That's why I'm not saying much of anything these days, Evelyn. I'm just working. Because work's the one thing I've got left that can't lie. A fence is either fixed or it isn't. A roof either holds water out or it doesn't. I figured if there's any way back to you trusting a single thing about me again, it isn't going to come through my mouth. It's going to come through whatever you see me actually do, day after day, for as long as it takes, with no promise attached about when that ends. Evelyn was quiet a long moment, looking at him in the slanting afternoon light, and something in her face had softened, just slightly, just enough for Silas to notice, and not enough for him to dare hope too far ahead of himself. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me since I found out your name," she said. "Maybe the only honest thing left worth saying," Silas said. "Everything else, I figure you've got to watch for yourself and decide on your own time." The months that followed tested that patience harder than either of them expected. There were good days. Days when Evelyn let him sit at her table again, not for full meals, not yet, but for coffee in the evenings, the two of them talking plainly about ordinary things, the weather, the price of feed in town, Mary Beth's stubborn refusal to learn her letters fast enough to satisfy her own ambitions. And there were bad days, days when some careless word reminded Evelyn fresh of the lie, and she'd go cold and quiet again for a stretch. And Silas learned not to push on those days, just to keep working, keep showing up, keep proving the one thing words couldn't. Garrett Voss came out twice more over those months, business that genuinely required Silas's attention back at the ranch. And both times Silas noticed Evelyn watching those visits with a wary, searching look, like she was testing herself as much as him, testing whether the sight of Granger Ranch business rolling up the dirt tracks still stung the way it had that first terrible afternoon. It did, some. He could see it in her shoulders, but it stung a little less each time, and that, he understood, was its own kind of progress, slow as it was. The town of Millbrook, too, took its time coming around to the strange new reality of Silas Granger, working a poor widow's land for no pay, no fanfare, no apparent benefit to himself that anyone in town could puzzle out. There was gossip, plenty of it, some unkind, speculating he was working some long con, building towards some claim on Harper land he hadn't revealed yet, some merely baffled, unable to make sense of a rich man choosing dirt under his fingernails when he could have bought the whole valley's labor with a single bank draft. Evelyn heard the gossip too, in town, from women who meant well and women who didn't, and Silas watched her decide, slowly and on her own terms, what she believed about it versus what other people whispered. It was Mrs. Calloway, the same woman Mary Beth had once mentioned approvingly, who finally said something to Evelyn that Evelyn later repeated to Silas, almost in spite of herself, on a cool evening near the start of autumn. "She told me," Evelyn said, sitting across the porch step from him, the same step where he'd eaten his first heel of cornbread all those months back, "that whatever a man used to be, what matters is what he does when nobody's making him do it anymore. Said the whole town's watched you out here every day since spring, working for nothing and asked nothing back, and that a con man gets bored a lot faster than 4 months running. Mrs. Calloway sounds like a wise woman. She's a gossip same as anybody in that town," Evelyn said, "but she's not wrong either." She was quiet a moment, looking out at the property. Fences mended, roofs solid, garden green and full again, the well running clean and steady. "I keep waiting for you to get tired of this, waiting for the rich man to remember he's rich and ride off back to his soft bed and his 11 rooms and decide poor folks' chores aren't worth his time anymore. You haven't yet. I keep waiting, and you haven't yet." "I'm not going to," Silas said. "Not because I'm proving something to the town, or to you, though I won't lie and say some part of me doesn't want your good opinion back. I'm doing it because somewhere in these months I've figured out that this," he gestured loosely at the fence, the barn, the whole modest spread of land around them, "is more real to me than anything I built with money ever was. I had a fortune for 40 years, Evelyn, and not 1 hour of it ever felt like this does. I'm not interested in going back to a life that empty. Whether you ever let me sit at your table as more than a hired hand or not, I intend to keep showing up here, working this ground, because it's the only place I've ever felt like the man I actually want to be, instead of the man my money turned me into." Evelyn didn't say anything to that for a long while, but she didn't get up and walk away either, and when Mary Beth came out onto the porch a few minutes later, drawn by the sound of voices, Evelyn didn't send her back inside this time. She let the girls sit down between them, let her chatter on about nothing in particular, let the evening stretch out easy and unhurried in a way it hadn't. Between the three of them, since the secret broke everything apart, and Silas understood, watching the last light fade gold over fields that had nearly died and now stood green and full, that something was beginning to mend that no amount of fence fixing alone could have managed. Something slower, harder won, and worth, he was starting to believe, every single day it was taking to rebuild. The autumn that followed brought the valley back fuller than anyone had dared hope after a drought that bad. Fields that had been cracked and gray in the spring stood gold now with grain. The cottonwoods along the Harper property had leafed back out thick and green, and the thin, desperate stream that had first announced Silas's betrayal had widened into something closer to a proper creek, fed steady by autumn rains that finally, mercifully, started falling on their own without any man's hand turning a key to make them come. Silas kept working. That hadn't changed, not through the long hot months of summer, not now as the air turned crisp and the work shifted from fence mending to harvest. He'd built himself a small lean-to shelter near the property line by then, not quite living on Harperland and not quite living off it either, a kind of deliberate middle distance that let him show up every morning without presuming he'd earned a place inside the house itself. Evelyn never told him to stop. That was, he'd come to understand, about as close to an invitation as she was willing to offer for a long while. The absence of an order to leave, standing in for the words she wasn't ready to say outright. It was Tom Reeve, of all people, who finally pushed Silas toward asking for more than that. "You've been crawling on your belly for this woman 6 months now," Tom said one evening, out at the Granger Ranch where Silas had ridden back briefly to settle some overdue paperwork Voss couldn't handle alone. Fixed every board on that property twice over, probably. At some point, Silas, groveling, stops being humility and starts being its own kind of cowardice. "You ever think of that? I'm trying to earn back something I broke," Silas said. "That takes time, Tom. You don't rush a thing like that." "No," Tom agreed. "You don't rush trust. But you can't build it standing in a field 100 yards off from the woman either, too scared to ask her plain what she wants from you. At some point, a man's got to open his mouth and ask the question instead of just hoping the work answers it for him." He fixed Silas with the same flat, unimpressed look he'd been giving him for 30 years whenever Silas tried to negotiate his way around something he was actually afraid of. "You're a rancher who built an empire out of nothing, and a successful businessman who's negotiated harder deals than most men dream of. And you're telling me you can't find the nerve to ask a widow plain if there's still a place for you at her table?" Silas didn't have a good answer for that. He rode back to the Harper place 2 days later with the question sitting heavy in his chest, and it was Mary Beth, as it so often seemed to be in this family, who cracked the door open for him without meaning to. She'd taken to following him again through the autumn months, her mother's restriction long since relaxed, and she trailed him out to the creek one evening while he checked the new culvert he'd built to keep the bank from washing out come spring floods. "Mr. Silas," she said, swinging her bare feet in the cold water despite her mother's certain disapproval, "are you ever going to ask Mama to marry you?" He nearly dropped the tool in his hand. "What makes you ask a thing like that?" "Because you look at her the way Papa used to," Mary Beth said, with the same blunt clarity she'd had that first week, asking if he was honest. "And because she stopped being mad at you mostly, even though she still acts like she is sometimes when she thinks I'm not paying attention. And because Mrs. Calloway says a woman doesn't let a man fix her fence for free 6 months running unless she's hoping for something more than fences." "Mrs. Calloway," Silas said, "talks a great deal for a woman who runs a dry goods store." "That's what Mama says too," Mary Beth said, unbothered, "but she still listens to her." He didn't answer the girl's question directly, but it sat with him the rest of that evening, and the evening after, until he found himself 3 days later standing in front of Evelyn on the porch in the gold light of early evening with something he'd been carrying in his coat pocket for nearly a week, working up the nerve to say what needed saying. It wasn't a ring. He'd thought hard about that. Had even, in a weak moment, considered riding into the territory's largest town to buy something fine, something that would announce in stone and gold exactly how much he could afford to give her. He'd stopped himself before he got further than the thought. That was exactly the kind of mistake that had broken things the first time, reaching for money as the answer when the truth was the only currency that had ever actually mattered between them. What he had instead was smaller, older, and worth more to him than anything in his ranch house's 11 rooms. A thin gold band that had belonged to his mother, The only thing of value she'd owned in a life spent dirt poor before Silas ever built the Granger fortune. A ring she'd worn through years of hardship he barely remembered now, except in fragments, and that he'd kept locked away in a drawer for 40 years without ever once considering giving it to anyone, because no one in those 40 years had ever made him think of his mother's hands, work-worn and steady, giving away whatever little she had to whoever needed it more. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "I've got something I want to say, and I'd be grateful if you let me get all the way through it before you answer, because I've been working up to this a long while, and I'm liable to lose my nerve if you stop me part way." Evelyn, sitting on the porch step shelling beans into a bowl in her lap, went still, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, wary but not closed off, the way she might watch weather building on the horizon, unsure yet whether it would bring rain or just more wind. "Go on then," she said. "I came to this valley a man who didn't believe in much of anything except what he could buy," Silas said. "I'd built a fortune big enough to insulate me from every hard thing this land does to ordinary people. And somewhere along the way, that insulation turned into a kind of loneliness I didn't even have a name for, because nobody around me ever wanted anything from me except what was in my pocket. I came out here looking for proof that there was something else left in people. I found it on your porch step, in a heel of bread you couldn't spare, and a cup of water you gave a stranger without asking his name first." He paused, working through the rest of it, watching her face for any sign she wanted him to stop, finding none. "I broke something precious trying to fix a problem I didn't know how to fix any other way, and I know I don't get to undo that. Not fully, not ever. But I've spent 6 months trying to show you, instead of just telling you, that the man who fixed your fence and slept in your barn wasn't a lie. He's the realest thing I've ever been. And I'd like, if you'll have me, to spend whatever years I've got left being exactly that man, here with you and Mary Beth, for as long as you'll let me." He held out the ring then, small and plain in his weathered palm. Nothing like the kind of jewel a man of his fortune could have bought 100 times over. "This was my mother's," he said. "She had nothing else worth leaving anybody when she passed. I've kept it 40 years without giving it to a single soul, because I never met anyone who reminded me of her until I met you. I'm not offering you a diamond, Evelyn. I'm offering you the one thing I own that was ever given to somebody out of love instead of bought. I figured of everything I've got, it's the only thing worthy of asking you to wear." Evelyn set the bowl of beans down slowly on the step beside her, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all, just looked at the small ring in his outstretched hand, and Silas felt his heart hammering in a way it hadn't hammered even standing at the canal gate in the dark, even facing down Garrett Voss's recognition in her own front yard. "You could have bought me anything," she said finally, quiet. "Anything in the territory. I half expected, if this day ever came, you'd show up with something that costs more than this whole property's worth, because that's what rich men do when they want to prove something." "I thought about it," Silas admitted, "and then I thought about what it would mean, handing you something bought with money I never once had to work for, after everything that money already cost us. It didn't feel right. This felt right. I don't know how else to explain it except that money was never what was missing between us, Evelyn. It was the truth. I'm trying to give you the truest thing I've got left." Evelyn reached out, finally, and took the ring from his palm, turning it over in her fingers. And when she looked back up at him, there were tears standing in her eyes that she didn't bother hiding. "I was so angry at you," she said, "angrier than I think I've ever been at another living soul. Not just because you lied, Silas, though that was bad enough. I was angry because for 2 months I let myself believe that the world still had decent men in it who didn't need anything from a poor widow except her company, and finding out you were the richest man in 3 counties the whole time felt like finding out even that small mercy had a price tag on it I just hadn't seen yet." "I know," Silas said. "I understood that the moment Voss said my name in your yard. I understood exactly what I'd taken from you, on top of everything else. I'd taken the proof you'd found too, that kindness given freely doesn't always come back around with strings attached. I've spent every day since trying to give that proof back to you a different way. Not with my name, with my hands." "You did," Evelyn said softly. "I want you to know that, Silas. Whatever I decide to say to you right now, you did give it back. Every fence, every board on that roof, Every hour you spent out here for nothing, asking nothing, while half the county whispered you were either a fool or a liar, and you let them whisper it without once trying to set them straight by telling them who you really were and what you were really worth. That's not something a man does to win back a woman's hand, not if all he wanted was a quiet conscience. That's something a man does because somewhere along the way it stopped being about winning anything back and started just being who he was. It did, Silas said. Somewhere in those months it stopped feeling like penance, Evelyn, and just started feeling like the life I wanted. I'd still be out here every day, ring or no ring, answer or no answer. I just didn't want to keep hiding the fact that what I want, more than anything I've ever wanted with all my money behind me, is to be your husband. To raise Mary Beth alongside you. To wake up every morning on this land instead of in that house with 11 rooms that never once felt like anything but a place to keep my things. Evelyn looked down at the ring again, small and worn and plain, and then she looked up at Silas, at the man who'd arrived at her porch in a thin coat with a half-truth of a name, who'd eaten her last cornbread like it was the finest meal of his life, who'd worked her land for 6 months without a cent of payment because the work itself was the only language he had left that she could trust. And something in her face finally let go of the last guarded distance she'd been holding between them since the day Garrett Voss rode up that dirt track. "Yes," she said simply, her voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, Silas, I'll marry you. Lord help me. I think some part of me decided that a long time before you ever worked up the nerve to ask." He didn't remember crossing the distance between them, only that one moment he was standing in the yard, and the next he had her in his arms on that porch step, and Mary Beth, who it turned out had been watching the whole exchange from the window, not nearly as subtle about her eavesdropping as she believed herself to be, came tearing out the front door, whooping loud enough to startle the chickens, throwing herself into the middle of the embrace with the unrestrained joy of a child who'd just gotten exactly the answer she'd been quietly hoping for since the day she first asked him if he was honest. They married in the spring, in a ceremony that bore almost no resemblance to the kind of wedding the Granger name and Granger fortune might have once commanded. There was no grand hall, no governor in attendance, no 14-course dinner served on the same china that had once held a roast for a table full of guests who'd never once grieved him as a man. Instead, they married in the yard of the Harper homestead, under the cottonwoods that had come back full and green, with half of Millbrook turning out to witness it, not because they'd been invited out of obligation or social maneuvering, but because over the past year the valley had watched Silas Granger transform from a name on a deed into a man they'd actually come to know, dirt under his fingernails and all, and they wanted to see for themselves how the strange story ended. Doc Aldridge was there, and Mrs. Calloway gossiping happily through the entire ceremony about how she'd known it would end this way months before anybody else admitted it out loud. Garrett Voss came too, standing a little stiffly at the back in his good coat, looking faintly bewildered by the whole informal affair, but genuinely moved by it all the same. Tom Reeve gave Silas a clap on the shoulder before the ceremony that communicated more affection than 30 years of careful Western reticence usually allowed itself to show. Even some of the families Evelyn had quietly fed through the worst of the drought came. Children who'd once sat hungry at her table, now grown a little taller, a little sturdier, standing with parents who understood, in the unspoken way that hard communities understand these things, exactly what kind of woman Evelyn Harper was, and exactly what kind of debt the whole valley owed her, whether she'd ever asked to be repaid for it or not. Mary Beth stood beside her mother through the whole ceremony, solemn with the importance of her role and beaming with happiness in equal measure. And when the moment came for Silas to place his mother's ring on Evelyn's finger, the girl let out an audible, delighted gasp that drew laughter from half the gathered crowd and broke whatever last formal stiffness had been hanging over the proceedings. "I told you he was honest," Mary Beth informed her mother afterward, with the satisfied air of a child who considered the matter conclusively settled, and Evelyn, laughing through tears for the second time that day, pulled her daughter close and told her she'd been right all along. The ranch, the actual Granger Ranch, the 11-room house, and the 12,000 head of cattle, and the fortune that had started this whole journey, didn't simply vanish from the story. Silas didn't burn it down or give it away in some grand symbolic gesture, though Tom Reeve later admitted he'd half expected exactly that kind of dramatic flourish from a man who'd spent the better part of a year proving he'd rather work for nothing than live comfortable on money alone. Instead, Silas did something quieter, and in its own way, harder. He kept the ranch running. The cattle still needed tending, the hands still needed paying. The business of it still mattered to the dozens of families whose livelihoods depended on Granger land staying productive. But he moved the center of his life entirely to the Harper homestead, expanding it modestly over the following year, not into some grand estate, but into something that stayed recognizably the same humble place Evelyn had built with her first husband, just sturdier now, more capable of weathering whatever the land threw at it next. He used a portion of his fortune, finally, openly, the way he should have considered doing from the very start, not to buy Evelyn's affection that had never been for sale, and he understood that now better than he understood almost anything else in his life, but to do for the whole valley what he'd done in secret, in the dark, with a stolen midnight ride and a turned key. He funded a permanent expansion of the irrigation system, this time properly, with the sheriff's blessing and the valley's full knowledge of where the water was coming from and why, so that no drought, however bad, would ever again be allowed to grind a community like Millbrook down to nothing, while a rich man's land stayed lush 15 miles away behind a locked gate. He didn't do it for credit. He insisted, in fact, that the project be attributed simply to the Valley Water Cooperative, with his name kept off the official record entirely, because he'd learned, the hard way, that the giving meant more when it didn't come wrapped in a man's reputation. "You could put your name on it," Evelyn told him once, watching the new canal works being built along the river, a permanent solution this time, instead of a desperate midnight gamble. "Nobody in this valley would think less of you for it now. They know who you are. They've watched what you've done since." "I know they wouldn't think less of me," Silas said, "but I spent 40 years putting my name on everything I built, Evelyn, and I can tell you from the inside of that life, it never once made the giving feel any better. It just made people grateful to my name, instead of grateful to whatever good the thing itself actually did. I'd rather the water just be water this time. Let the valley be glad for the rain coming back instead of glad to me for sending it." Evelyn studied him a long moment, the way she still did sometimes, even now, cataloging the man he'd become against the man she'd first pulled a shotgun on, and something in her expression told him she understood, more fully than perhaps anyone else alive, exactly how far he'd traveled to arrive at that particular piece of wisdom. It would be its own kind of lie to say that everything afterward unfolded smooth and easy, the way a story sometimes promises but real life almost never delivers. Silas and Evelyn argued, in the ordinary way married people argue, about money sometimes. Evelyn's deep-rooted frugality, born of years of genuine scarcity, occasionally colliding hard against Silas's instinct to simply solve problems by spending on them. An instinct 40 years of wealth had carved into him so deep it didn't disappear just because he'd learned to distrust it. There were nights, especially early in the marriage, when Evelyn would catch him quietly paying for something he'd promised to leave to her judgment, and the old wound about secrets and unilateral decisions would flare raw again, sharp enough that Silas learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that earning trust back wasn't a single dramatic gesture with a ring on a porch step. It was 1,000 small, honest choices, repeated for years. The same unglamorous discipline that had rebuilt her trust the first time around, now required to maintain it. Mary Beth grew, the way children do, faster than either of her parents quite prepared for, and there were ordinary hard years woven through the good ones. A bad winter that took half the new calves. A stretch when Mary Beth fell in with town friends Evelyn didn't entirely trust. A season when Silas's old business instincts and Evelyn's hard-won frugality clashed over how to handle a failing neighbor's debt in a way that took both of them weeks to talk through properly. None of it was the smooth, photograph-perfect family life that money alone might have promised, back when Silas still believed money was the thing that solved problems. It was harder than that, messier than that, full of small frictions that never fully went away just because the love underneath them was real. But it was, by every measure that had ever actually mattered to Silas Granger since that night on his own porch, watching his dinner guests grieve a will reading instead of a man, it was real. It was a life built on people who knew exactly who he was, every flawed and complicated piece of it, and chose to stand beside him anyway, not because of what he could give them, but because of who he'd shown himself, slowly and imperfectly, to actually be. 5 years on from the day the drought finally broke, the Harper Granger Ranch, that was what the valley had taken to calling it, somewhere along the way, neither name crowding out the other, had become something neither Silas nor Evelyn had quite set out to build, but both of them had grown to understand was the truest thing either of them had ever made. It started small, the way most good things in that valley seemed to start. A traveling family, caught in a hard stretch between jobs, stopped at the homestead one evening the same way Silas once had, hungry and uncertain of their welcome. Evelyn fed them without a second thought, the same as she'd have done any year of her life, drought or plenty. But this time, Silas was standing right there beside her, and instead of simply watching the way he once had, struck silent by a generosity he didn't yet understand how to offer himself, he pulled up an extra chair to the table and asked the family where they were headed and whether they needed work, because by then the ranch had grown enough, prospered enough, that there was real honest labor to offer a man passing through hungry. Work that paid fair wages instead of charity, dressed up as a transaction. That family stayed 3 months before moving on to land of their own. They weren't the last. Word traveled the way it does in places like Millbrook, that the Harper Granger spread was a place where a hard-luck traveler could find a meal, and if they wanted it, honest work to go alongside it. No questions asked about a man's past. No name required beyond whatever he was willing to give, because Silas Granger, of all people, understood better than almost anyone alive exactly how much a person's dignity could depend on not being pressed too hard about where they'd come from or what they'd left behind. "We could turn travelers away," Evelyn said once, watching another wandering family ride off down the road after a few weeks' stay, fed and rested and pointed toward better prospects further west. "Plenty of folks would say we've done our part. Nobody could fault us for it." "We could," Silas agreed, "but I think about that drifter who showed up at your porch with a lame horse and a borrowed name, and I think about what would have happened to him if you'd decided that day you'd already done your part, that feeding one more stranger wasn't worth the risk." He shook his head. "I owe too much to a woman who didn't think that way to ever let myself think it now that I've got the means to do something about it." It was in its own quiet fashion the truest answer either of them had ever found to the question that had started this whole long, hard, winding road, whether kindness given freely, without expectation of anything returned, still existed in a world that mostly ran on transaction and self-interest. Silas had set out 2 months at the start of all this, looking for proof of it in a single act, a single porch, a single cup of water from a single stranger. What he found in the years that followed was something larger and slower and harder won than any single proof could have offered. The understanding that kindness wasn't a fact you discovered once and then carried with you forever, settled and certain. It was a practice, a choice renewed every single day by people who had every reason, every hard year, and every empty well to decide they'd given enough and owed nothing further to strangers passing through. The valley had given that gift to Silas Granger first, in the unlikely shape of a hungry man's heel of cornbread. He spent the rest of his life trying to make sure it kept moving forward, person to person, the same way it had once moved to him. Mary Beth grew up on that ranch and into a young woman the whole valley spoke well of, sharp-tongued like her mother, stubborn like both her parents combined, with an instinct for fairness that everyone who knew her recognized had been built, brick by brick, out of watching her mother feed hungry children through the worst drought the valley had ever seen, and watching the man she eventually called Papa spend a full year proving with his own 2 hands that character outweighed fortune every single time the two came into conflict. She would tell the story herself, decades later, to children of her own gathered around a fire on cold winter evenings. The story of a rich man who pretended to be poor, and a poor woman who'd never once needed pretending to be rich in the ways that actually counted, and how the two of them had nearly lost everything over a lie told out of fear, and had only found their way back to each other through the patient, unglamorous work of proving trust instead of simply asking for it. "What's the lesson then?" her own children would sometimes ask her, the way children do, wanting the moral of a story handed to them plain and simple. And Mary Beth, older now, with her mother's sharp eyes and something of Silas's careful, weighing patience in the way she answered hard questions, would think about it a long moment before she answered. "The lesson," she'd say, "is that money can buy you almost anything in this world except the one thing that actually makes a life worth living. It can't buy you somebody who will feed you when you've got nothing to offer back. It can't buy you a friend who stays angry at your lie precisely because she expected better of you, instead of not caring enough to be angry at all. And it surely can't buy you forgiveness. That's the one thing in this world a person has to earn the long, slow, unglamorous way, one honest day at a time, with no guarantee it'll ever fully arrive. She'd pause, looking at the fire, remembering a porch step and a heel of stale cornbread, and a stranger who'd looked, to an 8-year-old's eyes, like exactly nobody at all, and turned out, in the end, to be exactly the man worth knowing. My mother gave a hungry stranger her last bit of food because that's simply who she was, not because she expected anything in return. And my papa spent the better part of his fortune and every ounce of his pride learning to be worthy of a kindness he never could have bought. That's the whole lesson, far as I ever understood it. The richest man in 3 counties came looking for proof that decency still existed in this hard world, and he found it on the porch of the poorest woman he ever met. And it cost him everything he thought he wanted and gave him back everything that actually mattered. The ranch stood for decades after that, weathering droughts and hard winters and all the ordinary trials any working land endures. But it never again turned away a hungry traveler at the gate. Not in all the years Silas Granger and Evelyn Harper lived to see it prosper. Not in all the years their children and grandchildren kept that same simple promise alive long after the two of them were gone. It became known, eventually, across that whole stretch of frontier, not for the size of its herds or the wealth behind its name, but for something far rarer and far harder to build. A reputation earned the slow way for taking in anyone who showed up at its gate with nothing, and treating them every single time like they already belonged.